When my husband told me, "I've invited my old college friend Delphine to your sister's engagement gala. She's practically family, and if you trust me, you'll understand." I smiled over my morning coffee and said, "Of course, sweetheart. Whatever makes you happy." What he didn't know was that I had already pulled up the contact information for Dr. Theo Lecoy, Delphine's husband, on my phone the night before. And by the time the gala candles were lit at the Royal Ontario Museum 3 weeks later, Theo would be standing at my side in a charcoal tuxedo while my husband's world collapsed in front of every important person in our family's orbit. My name is Clara Bellarose, and I am 36 years old. I was born in Montreal but moved to Toronto for graduate school, where I met Nathaniel Ashcroft during a rainy October in my second year. He was in his last semester of business school at Rotman, and I was halfway through a master's in heritage conservation. We married 4 years later at my parents' cottage on Lake Muskoka, with loons calling across the water during our vows. That was 7 years ago. Nathaniel is now a managing partner at a venture capital firm on Bay Street, with a portfolio thick enough that my family, old Quebecois money with a weakness for understatement, considered him a catch. I always thought I had caught him, too. I was wrong. The announcement came on a Sunday afternoon at my parents' home in Rosedale, over my mother's lamb roast and Niagara Pinot Noir. My younger sister, Genevieve, was there with her fiancé, Hugo, a cardiologist from Ottawa. They had gotten engaged in June at Peggy's Cove, and the gala to celebrate was to be held at the ROM in 3 weeks. A black tie affair that my mother had been planning since the ring went on. It was supposed to be the most important night of Genevieve's year. Speaking of the gala, Nathaniel said, folding his napkin with that careful precision he saves for announcements he wants to sound casual. "I've invited Delphine Moreau. She's been back in Toronto for a few months, and we've been catching up. She's practically family at this point." My father's wine glass paused an inch from his mouth. Hugo, who did not know the history, simply looked confused. Genevieve's fork clinked sharply against her plate, a sound I had not heard since our teenage years when she used to signal me that danger was near. "Delphine," my mother said slowly, her accent sharpening the way it always does when she is appalled but too polite to show it. "The Delphine from Queens? That's the one," Nathaniel said breezily. "You remember how close we all were in school." Nobody remembered that, because it had never been true. Delphine Moreau had dated Nathaniel for 2 years at Queen's University more than a decade ago. My mother had met her exactly once, at a hockey game in Kingston, and my sister had never met her at all. But Nathaniel was building a history in real time, laying bricks of a wall that had never existed, and my family was too stunned to interrupt. "She helped your mother organize that fundraiser for the hospital gala in 2019, Nathaniel added, buttering a roll with the same hand he used to wear his wedding ring. Remember, my mother had not organized a hospital fundraiser in 2019 or any other year. She had served on a silent auction committee once for the Princess Margaret, but she had not organized anything, and Delphine Moreau had certainly not been there. Still, my mother nodded faintly, caught between her manners and her shock. "She's been going through a rough time," Nathaniel continued. "I thought it would be good for her to be around friendly faces. The timing is perfect." Hugo glanced at Genevieve, who had gone very still. Under the table, her heel pressed against mine, a Morse code from childhood. My father cleared his throat and took a long sip of wine. And my husband, the man I had been sleeping beside for 7 years, turned to look at me with something new in his eyes. Not challenge exactly. More like a dare. "Right, Clara? You don't mind." The correct answer was no. The correct answer was to ask why on earth he was inviting a former girlfriend to my sister's engagement gala. The correct answer was to point out that Delphine had never been family, not his family, and certainly not mine. Instead, I reached for the bread basket and smiled like a woman who had not spent the previous evening on her laptop cross-referencing Instagram geotags with my husband's supposed work schedule. "Of course not, darling. I trust your judgment." The relief on his face was almost comical. He did not notice that my sister was staring at me as if I had sprouted a second head. The discovery had happened the way these things usually do, by accident, through an algorithm that does not care about anyone's marriage. I had been looking at Toronto art galleries on Instagram for a curatorial project when Delphine Moreau's profile appeared in my suggestions. I had not seen her face in 10 years, but I recognized the name immediately, and then I recognized the face too. She was blonde now, and thinner than she had been at Queen's. And she was standing in front of a group of 7 canvas at the AGO, in a photo taken less than a week earlier. Except Nathaniel had told me, 2 summers ago, that Delphine had moved to Geneva for a job with a Swiss auction house. He had mentioned it offhandedly, the way you mention that an old acquaintance has moved on with their life. But there she was, geotagged at Queen West, at a bakery in Cabbagetown, at a rooftop bar on King Street, week after week, month after month, and in one photo from early spring, she was wearing a silk scarf. I recognized because I had picked it out myself at Hermes en Bloor, a gift Nathaniel had supposedly bought for his mother's 70th birthday last December. His mother had never worn it, because his mother had never received it. I scrolled further back, my coffee cooling in my hand, my heart steady in a way that frightened me. A wedding photo from 5 years ago showed Delphine in white, smiling up at a tall man with silver at his temples. The caption read, 5 years with the love of my life, Dr. Theo Lacroix. Theo Lacroix. I typed the name into Google, and he came up instantly. A cardiothoracic surgeon at Toronto General, with a modest professional page and a quiet practice. He had the kind of face that has spent many late nights in operating rooms. I wrote his office number down on the back of a grocery list and put the list in my coat pocket. That night, Nathaniel came home from his Thursday squash game with the same cologne he had been wearing for the last 6 months, a cologne I had never bought him, and he kissed my forehead before disappearing into the shower. I sat at our dining room table, looking out over the Don Valley, and I did not cry. I was too busy thinking. On Monday morning, after Nathaniel left for Bay Street at 7, I opened his Rogers account online, because we shared billing. I pulled the statements for the last 9 months and I began to read. There was a charge at the Shangri-La on a Tuesday afternoon in February. He had told me he was in Calgary that day. There was a charge at Canoe, the expensive restaurant at the top of the TD Centre, on a Friday in March, when he had told me he was entertaining clients from Halifax. Except I had called the receptionist at his firm the week after, under the pretense of sending a thank you card, and she had cheerfully told me no clients from Halifax had come in that month at all. There were charges at Holt Renfrew that I had never seen the merchandise for. There were Uber Eats deliveries to a condo in Liberty Village on Wednesday nights when Nathaniel was supposedly at the gym. There was a charge at Burke's in early April, $4,200, and I did not own a piece of jewelry from Burke's that year or any other year. Delphine, however, had posted a photo on her Instagram in late April with diamond studs in her ears, caught at the right angle to catch the sunlight coming through her living room window. I built a folder on my laptop that I labeled Tax Receipts 2024 and I filled it with screenshots. I printed the important ones at the public library on Yonge Street rather than use the printer in our home office. I paid with cash for my photocopies. I did not mention any of it to Nathaniel, and when he asked what I had done that day, I told him I had been at the Toronto Reference Library looking at archival materials for a conservation project, which was technically true, because I had been in the building. On Wednesday of that week, I sat in my car outside Toronto General Hospital and waited for Dr. Theo Lacroix to finish his shift. I had his schedule from the hospital's surgical rotation posted online, and I had called the surgical unit pretending to be a patient's family member to confirm he was on that day. When he walked out of the north entrance at 6:12, still in his scrubs with his coat thrown over one arm, I got out of my car and said his name. He stopped. He looked at me. And he said, "Before I had explained anything, you're Nathaniel's wife." I nodded. "I wondered when this would happen," he said quietly. And then, with the same exhausted gentleness he probably used with patients' families after bad news, "There's a Tim Hortons across the parking lot. Do you want a coffee?" We sat in that Tim Hortons for 2 hours. He pulled out a small black notebook, the kind surgeons carry in their pockets, and he began to read. Conference weekends. Hotel receipts. Airline tickets to Banff that had not been a ski trip with colleagues but a long weekend with my husband. A joint visa charge at a jewelry store in Yorkville that Theo had only noticed because Delphine had never worn the earrings he thought he had paid for. He had the receipts in chronological order. I realized, looking at his quiet and tired face, that he had been gathering evidence for much longer than I had. He had been waiting for the moment when the timeline would tell him what his wife would not. "How long have you known?" I asked. "Suspected for about 8 months, he said. "Confirmed for 4. And you haven't confronted her?" I wanted to understand the full scope before I did. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "When you're a surgeon, you learn not to operate until you have the whole picture. Otherwise, you make things worse. I told him about the gala at the ROM. I told him about Nathaniel's casual announcement at Sunday dinner, the lie about Delphine being family, the hospital fundraiser my mother had never organized. I told him about my sister's face and my father's hand tightening on the stem of his wine glass. And then I told him what had been forming in my mind for days, the idea I had not quite been able to say out loud. My sister is getting engaged, I said. This is her night, not mine, and I will not let it be hijacked by this farce. But I have spoken to her already. I told her everything on Monday, and she told me something I didn't expect. She said, "Clara, you handle this your way. I would rather the truth come out before my wedding than poison it afterwards. Let the engagement gala be the thing that protects the wedding." Theo was quiet for a long moment. "What are you proposing?" he asked. "If Nathaniel wants Delphine there so badly, she should come. But she should come to something she is not expecting. And the two of them should be reunited with the two people they lied to. In public, with witnesses. No shouting, no scenes. Just the facts." Theo Lacroix, cardiothoracic surgeon, a man who had spent his career putting broken things back together, looked at me across a Tim Hortons table and almost smiled. "You're proposing that I come as your +1. "I am. Clara," he said, "my wife is going to walk into that museum on the arm of your husband, and she is going to see me standing next to you in a tuxedo, and her life is going to end in the middle of your mother's canapés." "Yes." He was quiet a moment longer. Then he said, "My father's family came from Chicoutimi. We don't forgive easily up there. Tell me the dress code." The next 3 weeks were a masterpiece of domestic performance. Nathaniel began coming home with flowers. Tulips on Tuesday, peonies on Friday, and a ridiculous arrangement of white roses the Wednesday before the gala that he said he had picked up on a whim. He made me cedar-planked salmon with wild rice, a dish from the early years of our marriage when he used to cook on Sundays. He asked me about my day with the attentive, performative concern of a man who suspects he may soon need alibis. He even offered to drive me to my mother's house the weekend before the gala to help her with the seating chart, an offer I declined with a smile. He had also booked himself a new tuxedo at Harry Rosen. I found the receipt in the inside pocket of his winter coat. He had bought new cologne, a bottle of Tom Ford that cost more than my first car. He had scheduled a teeth whitening appointment at a cosmetic dentist on Avenue Road. My husband, who had not cared about his appearance beyond a basic standard for years, was now grooming himself with the obsessive care of a man preparing for a date. Meanwhile, on my end, I was quietly preparing a different kind of evening. My sister and I met twice at her condo on Lakeshore Boulevard. We drank chamomile tea and went through every contingency. I told her exactly when I planned for Theo to arrive. I told her where in the museum I wanted the confrontation to happen, not in the main hall where her guests would be dancing, but in the reception area near the rotunda where the cocktails would be served and where the acoustics would carry. I asked her, again, whether she was sure. She looked at me with the same stubborn face she had worn at 8 years old when our cousin tried to take her hockey stick, and she said, "Clara, I would rather this happen in front of 200 people at my engagement than have you pretend for one more year." My mother was harder. I told her on a walk along the Beltline Trail in the last week before the gala. She listened in silence for 20 minutes, the two of us bundled in wool coats with the early November wind in our faces. When I was finished, she stopped walking, turned to me, and said in French, "Ma fille, ta grand-mère aurait fait la même chose. Je suis fière. My daughter, your grandmother would have done the same thing. I am proud." Then she took my arm, and we walked the rest of the trail without speaking. My father I did not tell. I knew my father. If I told him, he would do something. He would call his lawyer, or worse, he would call Nathaniel directly, and the whole thing would collapse into an ordinary, undignified argument. My father needed to see it with his own eyes. He needed the shock to carry him through the difficult part of letting go. On the morning of the gala, I woke at 6. Nathaniel was still asleep beside me, his face peaceful in the gray Toronto light. I looked at him for a long time, this man I had loved and married and cooked breakfast for, and nursed through a broken ankle 2 winters ago. I thought about how strange it was that I felt no anger in that moment, only a distant, clean sadness, like looking at a photograph of someone who had died. Then I got up and made coffee and began the work of the day. I had bought my dress at a small boutique on Ossington, a deep burgundy silk that fell to the floor with a small, dramatic train. I had chosen burgundy deliberately. Not emerald, not black, not the safe navy my mother-in-law had suggested when I had mentioned the gala over the phone. Burgundy is the color of red wine spilled on a white tablecloth. It is the color of consequence. I had my hair done at a salon in Yorkville by a woman who did not ask questions. I had my makeup done at home by a friend from graduate school who had known Nathaniel for as long as I had and who had, 3 days earlier, when I told her everything, said only, "What time should I arrive? And what shade of lipstick will ruin him the most?" At 6 in the evening, Nathaniel came out of the bedroom in his new tuxedo. He looked handsome, I will give him that. He spun in front of the mirror in our foyer and asked if the tie was straight, and I straightened it with steady fingers. "You look beautiful," he said, kissing my cheek. "So do you," I said. He hummed in the car all the way downtown. He was happy. I had not seen him this happy in months. The Royal Ontario Museum at night is one of the most beautiful places in Toronto. The crystal lobby was lit with amber and gold, and my mother had filled the rotunda with white orchids and pale greenery. Genevieve was radiant in cream silk, and Hugo looked faintly terrified, as grooms-to-be often do at these events. My parents greeted guests at the entrance of the Curly Gallery, where the cocktails would be served. My father, tall and straight-backed in his dinner jacket, pressed my cheek when he saw me and whispered, "Your mother told me. Be careful, Ma Belle. Be precise." I had not realized my mother would tell him, but I was grateful. I nodded and squeezed his hand. Nathaniel worked the room like the Bay Street partner he was, shaking hands, remembering names, laughing too loudly at my uncle's joke about the Leafs. His phone buzzed in his pocket every few minutes, and each time his hand twitched toward it. I knew what that was. Delphine was in an Uber on her way to the ROM. I knew, because Theo had forwarded me her text message 20 minutes earlier. Almost there. Save me a drink. At 7:30, the doors opened and Delphine walked in. She was stunning, I will not pretend otherwise. She wore black velvet with a diamond cuff on one wrist, her blonde hair swept back, and she walked into my sister's engagement gala with the confidence of a woman who believed she was entering friendly territory. She went straight to Nathaniel, who introduced her to my parents with the same manufactured ease he had used at Sunday dinner. My mother extended her hand with a smile that could have frozen the street, Lawrence River, and my father said, "So glad you could make it," in a voice I had not heard since he negotiated the sale of my grandfather's business. Delphine kissed my cheek when Nathaniel introduced us. I returned the kiss with the same warmth. "Clara, it is so nice to finally meet you. Nathaniel has told me so much about you." "He has told me almost nothing about you," I said, smiling. "But I am sure we will get to know each other tonight." She laughed, a little uncertainly. Nathaniel's hand tightened on her elbow, guiding her toward the bar. It was 7:42 when Theo Lacroix walked through the doors of the Curly Gallery. I had told him to come at 7:40. He was 2 minutes late. I would tease him about that later. He wore a charcoal tuxedo, and his silver hair caught the light from the chandeliers, and he walked across the room with the steady, unhurried pace of a man who has delivered difficult news many times in his life. The conversations near the entrance died first, in that strange rippling way that silence has. And then the silence moved outward across the room as people turned to see why the air had changed. Theo stopped beside me. He kissed me once, very lightly, on the cheek, a greeting between friends, nothing more, and then he turned and looked directly at his wife across the gallery. Delphine's champagne flute slipped from her hand and shattered on the marble floor. The sound was extraordinary. A small, crystalline explosion in the middle of a room that had gone entirely silent. Everyone turned. Nathaniel turned. He saw me first, then he saw Theo, and then he saw the way Theo and I were standing together, and his face went through 3 distinct expressions in 2 seconds. Confusion, recognition, and the pale, blank horror of a man who has just realized he is standing in the middle of a trap he cannot escape. "Theo," Delphine said. Her voice cracked on the second syllable. "Delphine," Theo answered quietly. His voice carried, because the room was so silent. "I believe you know my date for this evening." Nathaniel crossed the room in 4 strides. "Clara, what is this? What is he doing here?" "He is my +1, I said calmly. "Since you brought a guest of your own, I thought it was only fair." "Clara, this is not," Nathaniel began. "This is exactly what it looks like," I said. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to, because the entire gallery was listening. "Dr. Lacroix is Delphine's husband." You and Delphine have been having an affair for at least 9 months. Dr. Lacroix and I have been comparing notes for the last 3 weeks. A small sound came from behind me. It was my grandmother, 89 years old, a retired judge of the Ontario Superior Court, seated in a velvet chair near the bar. She tapped her cane once on the marble floor, the way she used to tap her gavel, and she said, in a voice that traveled across the gallery with the ease of decades of courtroom practice, "My goodness. Cross-examination in silk." I do not know who laughed first. I think it was my Aunt Marguerite, my father's sister, who had disliked Nathaniel since the day I brought him home. Her laugh was quickly smothered, but the spell was broken, and the room began to breathe again. Theo opened the leather portfolio he had been carrying under his arm. He did not open it theatrically. He opened it the way a doctor opens a chart. "I will not turn this into a performance," he said. His voice was quiet, professional, and it was the quietness that made it devastating. "But because you chose to bring my wife to this family event as your guest, Mr. Ashcroft, I will say this once, in front of the witnesses you invited. You have been traveling with my wife for the better part of a year under the cover of business trips. You have purchased her jewelry, clothing, and at least one weekend at the Post Hotel in Lake Louise. I have the receipts. Clara has the receipts for your end of it as well. We will not be raising our voices, and we will not be making a scene beyond this moment. But I wanted you both to know, and I wanted your families to know, that you have been seen." Delphine had not moved. Champagne was dripping from her hand, where a shard of glass had cut the edge of her palm, and she did not seem to notice. Nathaniel's mouth was open, but no sound was coming out. My father stepped forward. In the soft amber light of the Curly Gallery, he looked 10 years younger than he had that morning. He set down his whiskey glass on a passing waiter's tray with the care of a man who did not trust his own hands, and he said, "Nathaniel, I think it would be best if you and Madame Moreau left the building now. Henry." Nathaniel started. "You will not call me by my first name again in your life," my father said. Nathaniel looked at me. He looked at me the way he had looked at me on our wedding day, and I realized that this was the moment he understood that it was over, really over, in a way that he would not be able to talk his way out of. I did not look away. I met his eyes. I did not smile. I did not need to. "Clara," he said. "Goodbye, Nathaniel." Delphine was crying now, silently, in the way of women who have spent their lives being told not to make a scene. Theo did not look at her. He stepped aside, so she could walk past him, and she did, stumbling slightly on the marble, one hand pressed to her bleeding palm. Nathaniel followed, his tuxedo jacket rumpled somehow, though no one had touched him. The doors of the Curly Gallery closed behind them. A waiter appeared with a broom and began sweeping up the broken glass. The metaphor was almost too much. The room was silent for about 3 heartbeats. Then my grandmother tapped her cane again and said, loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Genevieve, ma petite, I think we should let your sister have the first toast of the evening. It seems only fair." Genevieve came to me and took my hand. Hugo came too, and my mother, and my father, and for a long moment we stood in the middle of the gallery like the last people standing after a storm. Then my sister kissed my cheek and whispered, "Thank you, Clara. Thank you." The rest of the evening proceeded, in a way. My mother, who had been raised to finish a dinner party no matter what, signaled the caterers to serve the canapés, and the guests, after the initial shocked whispers, did what Canadians do at moments like this. They talked about the weather, complimented the flowers, and gradually allowed the energy of the room to return to something resembling normal. My Aunt Marguerite cornered me near the bar and said, "I never liked him. Too much cologne. Men who wear that much cologne always have something to hide." My Uncle Bertrand raised his glass to a family with a backbone. And my grandmother, when I went to sit beside her, patted my hand with her thin, papery fingers and said, "Ma belle, you conducted that with more dignity than I saw in 40 years on the bench. I am so proud of you." Theo stayed until 9. We did not dance, because it would have felt wrong, but we sat together at a small table near the window and ate canapés neither of us tasted, and we talked about nothing in particular, the way strangers do after a shared disaster. Before he left, he shook my father's hand, and my father said, "Dr. Lacroix, you are welcome at our table any time." On the drive home, alone in the back of a taxi, I looked out at the lights of Toronto passing by, and for the first time in months, I cried. Not for Nathaniel, and not for the marriage, but for the version of myself I had been willing to be, the quiet wife who had told herself that her suspicions were unfair. I cried for her, and then, somewhere around the corner of Bloor and Spadina, I let her go. The weeks that followed were the ordinary weeks of the end of a marriage. My sister's fiancé's aunt, who was a family lawyer in Rosedale, met with me the following Tuesday and walked me through the process. Nathaniel's firm, I learned 3 weeks later, had politely encouraged him to take a leave of absence. Bay Street is a small town, and the story had traveled quickly, through the usual back channels. Delphine's contract with the auction house in Toronto was not renewed, though I had nothing to do with that directly. She moved back to Montreal, last I heard, and is working for a private gallery. Theo filed for divorce before Christmas. He sent me a Christmas card with a picture of his dog, a beagle named Sophie, and a handwritten note that said, "Thank you for the tuxedo, Clara. Be well." Genevieve and Hugo married in June on the shore of Lake Muskoka, in the same spot where I had married Nathaniel. I gave a reading during the ceremony, a poem by Margaret Atwood, and my voice did not shake. At the reception, my grandmother tapped her cane during the toasts and said, "To my granddaughters. May they always have the spine to tell the truth, even at dinner." Hugo's cousin, a woodworker from Prince Edward County named Gabriel, asked me to dance. He had sawdust under his fingernails, and he apologized for it in a shy, unpolished way. I told him not to worry about it. We have been having dinner once a week since July. He smells like cedar and coffee, and he never travels for work because his studio is in his barn. He has never owned a bottle of cologne in his life, and I find that, after Nathaniel, enormously restful. I sometimes think about the moment the champagne glass broke. I think about how small the sound was, in that enormous gallery, and how far it carried. I think about the way Theo Lacroix walked into the Curly Gallery like a man who had decided that enough was enough. I think about my grandmother's voice, dry as paper, saying cross-examination in silk. And I think about the fact that I, Clara Bellerose, who had been raised to believe that a woman's job was to keep the peace at the dinner table, chose instead to set a different kind of table, and to invite one very specific guest. Trust, I have come to understand, is not something you give because someone has asked you for it. It is something that is earned, slowly, over years, through 1,000 small truths, and when someone asks you to trust them while behaving in a way that does not deserve trust, they are not asking for trust at all. They are asking for permission to lie to you. I will never give anyone that permission again.